In the quiet corners of a bustling city, I learned that some laughter carries the sharp edge of a blade. My daughter, Clara, with her bright, modern life, taught me this when she dismissed my carefully chosen gift, unaware of the $500,000 secret it held. I watched her unknowingly auction it for a pittance, and in that silent observation, my world and my will irrevocably shifted. Mother, is this fake? Clara drawled, her manicured fingers barely touching the velvet box, as if contagion might leap from its antiquated surface. Her eyes, usually so vibrant, narrowed into skeptical slits. Good heavens, did you excavate this from a forgotten attic? What is this, some dreary relic from your humble beginnings? Her voice, usually so melodic, cut through the celebratory hum of her 35th birthday party like a jagged shard of ice. A ripple of uncertain laughter followed, a nervous titter that swelled when her husband, Leo, snorted and her teenage son, Finn, awkwardly hid a smirk behind his soda can. I stood there, my hand still outstretched, the small, hinged box yawning open in Clara's palm. The necklace, a delicate chain cradling a luminous emerald, lay limp and lifeless under the glittering chandeliers of her fashionable living room. A tremor, deep and ancient, ran through me, the oldest part of my spirit, the part that had endured so much momentarily buckled. But I held it in. I always did. The room teemed with her carefully curated life. Stylish friends, influential in laws, even her hyper-energetic fitness instructor had made the guest list. And me? I was merely mother, the quiet figure relegated to the periphery, the one who brought a peculiar, faintly musty-smelling gift instead of the latest designer clutch. I mean, Clara continued, tapping the emerald with a perfectly polished nail, it's sweet, in a truly tragic, vintage kind of way. Perhaps I can repurpose it as a prop for Halloween? More laughter, bolder now, echoed through the room. I didn't flinch, I didn't utter a word. I simply offered a faint smile, the kind I'd perfected over the decades, a fragile mask that held my trembling insides together. She passed the box around the table, a grotesque show and tell, each comment a fresh jab. You should really get that appraised, one woman gasped, feigning interest. Who knows, maybe it once belonged to a pirate. Another chimed in, no offense, but it does carry a distinct scent of mothballs. Someone else added, does your mother always gift? Heirlooms? Heirloom. If only they knew. That necklace had been my secret companion for 53 years, nestled untouched within a velvet pouch at the deepest recess of my dresser drawer, behind stacks of embroidered linen handkerchiefs. I hadn't laid eyes on it since 1986, yet I remembered its precise weight, its cool touch. I remembered the very day it became mine, the day I believed for a fleeting moment that I had finally been truly seen, that I finally mattered before he left. I hadn't planned to give it away today. A foolish flicker of sentiment, perhaps, a misplaced hope that Clara, now a mother herself, might grasp the profound significance of something quietly handed down across generations. Instead, she saw only rust, only decay. You could have at least polished it, she sneered, tossing the box carelessly onto the glass coffee table as if it were an unappetizing trifle. Still, I said nothing. Leo, her husband, poured her another glass of wine, oblivious. I retreated to the farthest end of the room, picking at a forgotten salad, as invisible as ever. Later, after the elaborate cake had been cut and devoured, Clara cornered me. Her tone, as always, shifted when no one else was within earshot. I really don't want you bringing this kind of junk into my home again, she whispered, her voice low but laced with an icy sharpness. You embarrassed me today. I looked at her, truly looked. The same girl whose fever I'd nursed through sleepless nights when her own father was absent. The young woman I'd held as she wept inconsolably after her miscarriage, while her mother-in-law remained chillingly silent. The child whose first month's rent I had secretly paid, safeguarding her fierce pride. "I'm sorry," I murmured, the familiar apology a well-worn path. She crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "You're always sorry, mother." But sorry doesn't erase the lingering scent from my designer sofa. Her eyes hardened, her gaze piercing through me. "You've overstayed your welcome, mother. This house, it's ours now. I know you mean well with the children, but honestly, you just get in the way. You leave things scattered, you forget appointments, you talk too much when my friends are here. I'm utterly exhausted." The words landed like a flurry of tiny, sharp pebbles, not enough to deeply wound, but relentless, chipping away at my resolve. She stepped closer. "Today was the final straw, all right. It's my birthday, and I want this house to feel like mine, not some antiquated nursing station." I nodded slowly, a ghost of understanding in my eyes. She didn't relent. "You have until Friday. Pack your things. I'll arrange for a week at a decent motel or something. But after that, please, don't come back, ever." I looked past her shoulder. My granddaughter, Lily, Clara's daughter, was laughing joyously, blowing out candles with her friends. Balloons bobbed near the ceiling fan, and the distant pop of a champagne cork punctuated the floating sounds of innocent mirth. I turned back to Clara. Her arms were still folded, her eyes meticulously avoiding mine. I wanted to ask her, "Do you remember when you had nothing? When your baby's father abandoned you, and I worked double shifts just to buy formula? Do you remember the cold, the fear, the days I barely ate so you wouldn't feel hunger?" But I didn't. I simply offered that same strained smile, not out of pride or peace or forgiveness, but because when you've been so utterly, irrevocably betrayed by someone you've dedicated your entire existence to, the only fragment of control you retain is the quiet dignity of your departure. I ascended the stairs, each step a testament to a lifetime of carrying burdens. I packed my meager belongings, a few worn sweaters, my blood pressure medication, an old, faded photograph of Robert. The velvet pouch was gone. I didn't even bother to search for it. As I descended, I passed the living room. Clara was already holding court, regaling her friends with dramatic tales of her crazy old mother and the haunted necklace I'd tried to foist upon her. I stood there for a second longer, utterly invisible in my own daughter's house. Then I opened the door, stepped out into the cold, unforgiving night. The last sound that reached me was Clara's voice, loud and clear, ringing with finality. "That was the last birthday I let that leech near me. She's not welcome here, ever," she meant it. And I, for the first time, believed her. The thread of memory. The spring of 1968. The air, even then, carried the lingering, almost metallic scent of a war that had finally ceased its roar. I was 24, working at a small, unassuming diner on the outskirts of our town. Our clientele mostly consisted of weathered truck drivers, their eyes tired, their laughs boisterous. But one quiet afternoon, a man walked in, his shoes polished, his shirt impeccably pressed. He didn't order coffee. He simply asked for directions to the bus station. I gave him the route and a hopeful smile. The next day he returned, and the day after that, his name was Thomas. He was a mechanic, he said, no family left. He liked the unhurried way I poured tea. 2 months later, we married at the courthouse. No guests, no cake, just a justice of the peace and the quiet echo of our vows. We rented a small room above a barber shop, where the persistent scent of shaving cream permeated our sheets. He'd bring me wild flowers wrapped in newspaper, and I'd make him hearty stews from salvaged chicken bones and potato peels. We had next to nothing, but I believed in us. In that kind of stubborn, almost foolish love, known only to the young and those who have carried a bruise, then the true war called him. He didn't want to go, but he did. For 2 long years, I lived in a purgatory of not knowing if he was dead or merely missing. When he finally returned, his eyes were different, haunted, distant. His hands, once so expressive, were quieter, colder. He never spoke of what he'd seen, and I never dared to ask. Instead, at night, I would press my ear against his chest just to feel the steady, reassuring rhythm of his return. Money remained tight. We shared a single winter coat between us. I sewed dresses from discarded curtains, darned socks until they were more thread than fabric. He worked 3 jobs. I picked up extra shifts at the diner. We painstakingly saved every single coin in a rusted biscuit tin, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Then, on our 10th anniversary, he asked me to close my eyes. I heard the soft, familiar snap of a velvet box. When I opened them, there it was, a necklace. A delicate gold chain with a singular, luminous emerald at its center. It was exquisite, the kind of piece worn by women in glossy magazines, the kind of dream I had never dared to allow myself. "Where did you get this?" I whispered, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. "I traded the car," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You always said green was your color." We no longer had a car, but I wore that necklace every Sunday after that. Only on Sundays, only to church. Then, carefully, meticulously, it went back into its pouch. I never allowed it to tarnish. I wiped it with soft linen. I whispered to it as if it held a sacred secret. People would remark that he must love me dearly, and I foolishly believed them. Then, 3 months later, he left. No note, no suitcase. Just an empty closet and a bank account with $5 left in it. I filed a report, waited by the door every evening, convinced he'd suffered a breakdown, a car accident, a kidnapping. Then I saw him, 2 towns over, holding another woman's hand, laughing the way he used to laugh with me. He saw me, he didn't flinch. I didn't cry in public. I simply turned and walked away. At home, I opened the velvet box. The necklace lay there untouched. I should have pawned it, I almost did, but I couldn't, because for 10 years I had given everything: my youth, my hopes, my silence, my unwavering love. And this single, sparkling jewel was the only tangible proof that once I had been chosen. I never wore it again after that day, but I kept it, because even when someone's love, or the illusion of it, vanishes, it lingers like a phantom perfume in an empty room, and I wasn't ready to clear the air just yet. Years unfurled. Clara was born. I raised her alone, never once telling her the true story of Thomas. She believed he'd died a hero in the war. It was simpler that way. I worked, I saved, I cooked. I taught her how to sew and how to read and how to stand tall, even when her knees shook. She blossomed into everything I hadn't been permitted to be: strong, outspoken, fiercely modern. And I thought, when she was finally ready, I would give her the necklace. Not for the gold, not for the emerald, but for the story. The bittersweet truth that even the most painful loves can leave behind something of profound beauty, if you only know how to look for it. But when I presented her with the box, she saw only rust. She didn't know it was the last tangible thing her father ever gave me. She didn't know it was once worth more than our tiny apartment. She didn't even ask. And I, in my ingrained silence, didn't tell her. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is the gentle offering you give instead of hate, the auction block of memory. The motel room reeked of bleach and an indefinable loneliness. The curtains didn't quite meet, leaving a sliver of streetlight to cut through the oppressive darkness, and the ceaseless hum of the vending machine just outside my door was a constant, irritating companion. Still, it was quiet. After 35 years of being everyone's emergency contact, everyone's last resort, this strange, sterile silence was a peculiar relief. 3 days after Clara had banished me, a glossy flyer caught my eye at the motel front desk. It was an invitation: charity auction and brunch hosted by the local Women's League. Clara's name, of course, was listed in elegant fine print: co-chair. I almost crumpled it, but an insistent pull, a perverse curiosity, held my hand. Perhaps I wanted to see her again. Perhaps I harbored a foolish hope that she might have softened, might have reconsidered. Or perhaps I simply needed to be in a room where people still dressed as if life held some semblance of worth. So I went. I donned my best coat, the one with the frayed lining, and found a quiet corner near the back. Nobody noticed me. Nobody ever truly did. Tables overflowed with crystal bowls, amateur paintings of lighthouses, knitted scarves, most of it clearly the kind of detritus people shed when downsizing. I was sipping lukewarm coffee, a bitter taste on my tongue when I saw it. Box 47. A velvet box. Familiar. Too familiar. I rose, my knees protesting from nights spent on thin motel mattresses and a lifetime of forgotten birthdays, but I moved with an almost ethereal grace, like someone half my age. There it was, my necklace, my necklace. The gold chain still held its luster under the harsh overhead lights, though the emerald seemed dimmer, as if it, too, knew it didn't belong here. Taped to the side was a small white tag. Vintage costume necklace. Starting bid, $10. Costume. The word landed with more force than Clara's laughter. I picked it up with both hands, tracing the faint scratch near the clasp, the almost invisible initials etched into its reverse. T.W. Thomas Williams. He had them engraved once before he vanished. I scanned the room. Clara was across the hall, holding court, laughing vivaciously with the mayor's wife, her neck adorned with pearls I knew she hadn't bought herself. Her voice soared above the chattering crowd, confident, effortless, so utterly assured of her place in the world. I stood there, cradling the box as the auctioneer's gavel rang. Box 47, he announced, his voice booming. A lovely vintage piece, perfect for holiday parties or a costume ball. I didn't speak. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply sat back down and watched. $10, someone called. $12, $15. Then a beat of silence. Any other takers? A woman in the front row, adorned in a lavender blazer and hair impossibly overdyed, raised her hand. $40 sold. I watched as my necklace disappeared into a flimsy plastic bag, handed off like a clearance item at a garage sale. The woman beamed, pleased with her bargain. Clara never glanced my way. Perhaps she didn't recognize me. Or perhaps, more likely, she simply didn't care. I left before the brunch concluded. Outside, the sun was too bright, the sidewalk scorching through the thin soles of my shoes. I walked 2 blocks before I allowed myself to cry. Not loud, messy sobs, but the kind of weeping that slips out in fractured pieces, like old pipes leaking, drop by agonizing drop. I found a worn park bench, sank onto it, and let the tears trace silent paths down my cheeks. It wasn't about the money, it never was. It was about memory, about meaning. That necklace was my past, the last tangible fragment of love from a man who, for all his sins, once looked at me as if I was the only thing on earth worth saving. Clara hadn't known, hadn't asked, hadn't cared. I fleetingly considered chasing after the woman in the lavender blazer, offering her double, triple, anything to reclaim it. But then what? Take it back and hide it in a drawer again, like a shameful secret? Some things, once discarded, are meant to stay gone. Instead, I returned to the motel room, sat on the edge of the bed, and retrieved my handbag. Tucked securely in its lining was a crisp envelope. Inside, the appraisal paper, dated 1985, signed by a renowned jeweler on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. Estimated value, $500,000. $500,000. I folded it neatly and placed it on the nightstand. Then, I stared at the stained ceiling and whispered, "She sold me for $40." And I wasn't talking about the necklace anymore. The night after the auction, sleep was a stranger. It wasn't sorrow that kept me awake, that raw, aching grief had long since calcified. nor was it anger. I'd swallowed too much of that over the decades for it to ignite now. It was something colder, heavier, the profound stillness that descends when a final, critical switch inside you quietly flips. I waited for the sunrise with the desperate anticipation of a condemned prisoner awaiting sentence. When the first tentative light pierced through the flimsy motel blinds, I rose, dressed in the same coat, the same worn shoes. I walked to the bus stop, catching the early route back to my old neighborhood. Not to Clara's house, of course. She had made it abundantly clear I was no longer welcome there. I was headed somewhere older, more resonant. The small house I had lived in after Thomas left still stood, though half the roof now sagged like the tired shoulders of an old woman. I had rented it out years ago, but the back unit, the one we'd always called the laundry room, I had kept for storage. A dusty key, hidden beneath a cracked flower pot, waited patiently. No one had touched it in years. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of forgotten things, heavy with cobwebs and an almost palpable silence. I moved to the corner, knelt beside an ancient oak dresser, and pulled away a loose floorboard. There it was, the fireproof tin box wrapped in a faded red scarf. My hands didn't tremble, not anymore. Inside the box were a few brittle birth certificates, a letter Thomas had written from overseas, still unopened, and an envelope, yellowed with age, simply marked in thick black pen, appraisal. I opened it, and there it was. Lexington Avenue, New York, 1985, appraised by Goldberg and Stein Jewelers. Item: one custom gold necklace with emerald centerpiece. Estimated retail value $500,000. I read it twice. Then a third time, $500,000. For decades, that piece of paper had meant little more than a curious footnote. I had never planned to sell the necklace. Its value wasn't monetary. It was about what it represented. A man's final, desperate act of tenderness before he vanished. A decade of fragile love pressed into a golden stone. I remembered the day I'd taken it to the jeweler. I was in the city for a cousin's funeral. On a whim, I'd stepped into the prestigious store, the necklace wrapped in tissue paper inside my handbag. I simply wanted to know if it was real. When the distinguished man behind the counter examined it, his eyes widened perceptibly. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice hushed with reverence, "this is museum quality. The emerald alone is a collector's piece. Have you considered insuring it?" I had laughed then. We could barely afford to insure our beat-up car. He'd offered to buy it on the spot, naming a sum I barely comprehended at the time. But I had left with the necklace and the paper, tucking it away in a place no one could steal it, not from me, not from my memory. Now the necklace was gone, and memory had become a liability. I sat on the concrete floor, staring at the paper. Clara had never asked about it. Not once had she inquired about its origin, its meaning. She saw something old and dull, something that smelled of a past she had no desire to acknowledge. But I knew what it had truly cost. Not just in money, but in dignity, in decades of waiting, in the way I had painstakingly forgiven a man who didn't deserve it, just so I could raise a child without hate festering in her bones. And now she had traded it for brunch chatter and a $40 bid from a woman in a lavender blazer. She hadn't just lost a necklace. She had lost the story. She had lost her mother's last, fragile attempt at connection. I folded the paper again, tighter this time, sharper. A new, unwavering resolve settled within me. Not rage, not vengeance, but absolute, piercing clarity. It was never about the jewelry itself. It was about recognition. It was about whether my life, my sacrifices, my silence, my boundless love truly meant anything to the one person I had given everything to. And now I had my answer. She didn't want the story, so I would rewrite the ending. The reclaiming of self, There was a time I swore I would never become my mother. Not because she was cruel, she was. Not because she failed us, she didn't. But because, in the end, she died quietly, almost forgotten by the very children she had poured her life into. And I had vowed not me, never me. My mother, Ruth, was a plain woman. She had strong, thick ankles, a voice as soft as worn velvet, and hands like cracked porcelain from decades of scrubbing floors, mending clothes, and lifting children who rarely offered a thank you. She raised five of us in a cramped two-room house with no indoor plumbing. She made soup from scavenged bones, dressed us in hand-me-downs, and kissed our foreheads as if each of us were the last child on earth. We didn't truly see her, not then. I remember the first time I saw her cry. I was 12. My brother Paul had just stormed out, declaring her rules from the Stone Age. She sat at the kitchen table after he left, her hands folded tightly, saying nothing. Then, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Just one. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. As we grew, we drifted from her. Not all at once, but steadily, like sand sifting through fingers. First, my sister, who married a man in another state and called less and less. Then my brothers, who only materialized when they needed money, a meal, or someone to watch their kids. I visited, yes, but not often enough. By her 70s, she was living alone, heating soup from cans, waiting for a phone to ring that barely did. I remember bringing young Clara to visit once. My mother reached for her, smiling with that familiar tenderness, but Clara clung to me, hiding her face. She didn't want to know this wrinkled woman with thinning hair and a stooped back. My mother pretended not to notice. That night, after Clara had fallen asleep in the car, my mother whispered, "You'll understand one day, Aliner. When you give everything and then become invisible." I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to imagine that future. But here I was, decades later, staring at her reflection not in a mirror, but in my own life. Alone, discarded, not out of malice, but out of casual dismissal. The same way one dismisses old wallpaper. Always there, quietly fading. I remembered cleaning out her house after she died. She had a small box under her bed, filled with cards we'd sent her. Birthday cards, Mother's Day cards, scribbled notes from childhood. Each one wrapped in tissue, treated like treasure. I had thrown most of them out. I was tired, grieving in a rush. Now I would give anything to hold those cards again, to see what she had seen in our scribbled ink and cheerful stickers and generic poems. To feel what she must have felt, alone in her bed, clutching paper memories as if they were warmth. I had promised myself, standing at her graveside, that I would never allow my life to end that way. That I would never become a woman who gave everything and was left with nothing. And yet, Clara's words echoed in my head. "You've overstayed, Mother. You just get in the way. You're not welcome anymore. Ever." I had become exactly what I feared. But unlike my mother, I had something she didn't: time and choice. I could sit in the sterile motel room, let my story end like hers did, gently, painfully, with no one truly watching. Or I could do what no one expected me to do. I could stop being endlessly generous to those who only ever took. I could stop being the woman whose name was only remembered on bills and hospital forms. I looked at the envelope again, the appraisal, the legacy, the irrefutable proof that I once mattered to someone, even if that someone had ultimately failed me. And I thought of my mother. I whispered, "You were worth more than they knew." Then I stood up. It was time to do what she never did, not out of revenge, but out of dignity. The final clause. I've always believed that when someone shows you who they truly are, you should believe them the first time. But with Clara, I kept inventing excuses, kept telling myself she was tired, overworked, stressed. That one day, she'd look at me and remember who taught her to walk, who stayed up all night through her croup, who sewed her prom dress by hand when we couldn't afford the boutique. But excuses don't rewrite truths. And the truth was simple: she didn't want me. Not in her house, not in her life, not in her future. So I decided I would stop giving her my past. 2 days after rediscovering the appraisal document, I took the envelope and walked to the corner of Pine and Jefferson, to a beige brick building with frosted glass windows and brass letters that read, Langston and Pierce, Estate Planning and Elder Law. The receptionist, a soft spoken young woman named Martha, looked up, startled to see someone my age walk in without a walker or an appointment. I'd like to revise my will, I stated, placing the envelope gently on the counter. Immediately she blinked, of course, one moment. She led me to a small room, warmly lit with the faint, comforting scent of pine. A box of tissues sat on the table, which I appreciated, not because I planned to cry, but because I didn't trust myself not to. Mr. Langston was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in his mid-40s, with kind eyes and temples just beginning to silver. He greeted me with a firm handshake that wasn't condescending. That alone earned him immediate points. "I've reviewed your previous documents," he said after we exchanged pleasantries. "Your daughter, Clara, is currently listed as sole beneficiary. Is that correct?" "It was," I said, my voice steady. "It won't be any more." He didn't ask why. "A good man. I want to remove her name entirely. All assets, the home, my savings, the remaining pension fund, I want transferred to someone else." "And who would that be?" he asked gently. I reached into my bag and pulled out a photograph. A woman in her 30s, dark hair pulled into a neat bun, smiling as she held a tray of tea beside my reading chair. "Her name is Maria," I explained. "She's been my caregiver for 5 years. She was there when I fell and couldn't get up. When I had pneumonia and no one came to visit. When I cried at night thinking I'd failed as a mother. She never asked for more money. She never judged my silence. She just stayed." Mr. Langston nodded, scribbling notes. "Does Maria know about this?" "No," I said, "and I don't plan on telling her until I'm gone." I took a breath. "I want her to have the house, the insurance, the few pieces of jewelry that are left, and I want her to know that someone saw her. That someone valued her presence." We spent the next 2 hours going over the documents. He walked me through every clause, every hypothetical scenario. What would happen if Maria passed before me? What would happen if Clara contested the will? "She will," I said calmly. "She'll be furious. Do you want to write a statement, something to explain your reasoning?" He offered. I thought for a moment, then nodded. He handed me a pen and I wrote, "To whom it may concern. This decision was not made in haste, nor out of malice. It is the result of years of silence, neglect, and a final act that illuminated the truth for me. Love is not measured in blood. It is measured in presence, in respect, in the way you hold someone's past without mocking it. My daughter, Clara Vance, is not a bad person, but she no longer sees me as a person, only a burden. Maria, however, saw me. Therefore, I leave her everything because she gave me something no one else did: dignity in my final years. May this not be seen as revenge, but as recognition. Eleanor Vance." When I handed the letter to Mr. Langston, he read it without a word, then placed it carefully in a folder and locked it in a drawer. "It's done," he said. "We'll notarize and file everything this week unless you change your mind." "I won't," I replied. Outside, the sun was bright but offered no warmth. The wind cut through my coat like tiny needles, yet I didn't shiver. I felt whole. Not happy, not vindicated, just deeply settled. That night, back at the motel, I made Maria a cup of tea, exactly the way she always made it for me, with a slice of lemon and a hint of honey. She didn't know what I had done. She didn't need to. She simply smiled, took the cup, and sat beside me on the worn couch. "You look different today," she observed. I whispered. "I finally did something for myself." She patted my hand, not pressing, not asking. And in that quiet moment, I knew I had made the right choice. Sometimes family isn't who shares your blood, it's who sits beside you when the world turns its back. The wrong emerald, the right end. I hadn't seen Clara in weeks. She didn't call, didn't text, and I didn't reach out either. Not because I sought to punish her, but because I had finally accepted a painful truth most mothers never want to face. Sometimes the child you raise isn't the person you hoped they'd become, but closure isn't a gift you wait for, it's one you give yourself. So I called her. She answered on the second ring. "Hello, it's me," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I'd like to take you to dinner. Just you and me." A pause. "Why?" she asked, suspicion in her tone. "I think we should talk." Another pause. Then, grudgingly, "Fine, fine." We met at a small Italian trattoria on the edge of town, the kind with red-checked tablecloths and flickering candles that smelled faintly of cinnamon. I chose it because it was quiet, neutral, devoid of any shared history. Clara arrived in a tailored beige trench coat, her hair pulled back tightly. She looked beautiful, but tired and deeply guarded. She didn't hug me. She sat down across from me, arms folded, her phone face down beside her. "I only have an hour," she stated. I nodded. "That's plenty." We ordered. She chose a meticulously undressed salad. I opted for the comforting richness of lasagna. For a long while, we ate in silence, the gentle clinking of cutlery filling the awkward space between us. Then I carefully placed a sealed envelope on the table. Her eyes narrowed. "What's this?" "Something you should read," I replied. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single copy of my newly revised will. Her name, once prominent, had been meticulously removed, replaced. She stared at the document, then back at me. This is a joke, right?" "No," I said, taking a sip of water. "It's not. You're leaving everything to Maria?" I didn't answer. She blinked, stunned. "She's your nurse, mother. She's not family." I looked at her, my gaze unwavering. She treated me like one. She pushed back from the table, her voice rising, edged with outrage. "You're punishing me because of a necklace?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Clara, I'm recognizing what you showed me that day. Who you truly are, and who I've been to you." "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "It was just a mistake. I didn't know, you didn't ask," I cut in. "You never asked. You never wanted to know." I leaned forward, my voice quiet, almost a whisper. "You sold something that represented the last bit of love and memory I had left from a time before you. You mocked it. You laughed in front of everyone. And then you got rid of it like it was trash." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "I'm your mother," I said, my voice trembling now, but only slightly. "But that day you sold me." I paused, then added the words I'd rehearsed in the mirror, the words that now felt like a liberation, "for $40. She stared at me, her hands beginning to tremble. "I didn't mean, but you did," I said softly. "You meant every word, every choice. You told me I was unwanted, a burden, and you meant it." She covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. "Mother, I didn't know it would hurt you like this." I nodded. "That's the difference between us, Clara. I always knew what hurt you. I spent my life protecting you from it." A tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it. "I made mistakes," she whispered. "I know," I said. "So did I." We sat there for a long time, no yelling, no drama, just the raw, unvarnished truth hanging between us. Eventually, she spoke again. "Is it too late to fix this?" I took her hand across the table, holding it gently. "I didn't come here for an apology, Clara. I came to let you know, that's all." She looked down, silent. The waiter brought the check. I paid. As we stood to leave, I placed one more envelope in her hand. It contained a photograph. The necklace, decades ago, worn around my neck on our 10th anniversary. "I hope one day you understand what it meant," I said. She nodded, her lips trembling. I didn't hug her. I didn't say goodbye. I simply walked out into the cool night, my coat wrapped tightly around me, and for the first time in years, I didn't look back.